Welcome to another Silicon Bites, and for this one, clowns assemble in Moscow for the Future Forum. Russia is not just a malignant adversary of the West, an aggressive actor on the world stage full of animosity and venom. No, it is not only that. We are not just dealing with a state that has delusions of imperial and even superpower grandeur. We're dealing with a country that collectively acts in a stupid manner, frequently against its own national interests. Russia has been described as a failed state, and there is a compelling case to make that there has been significant and steep decline in the quality of governance from Tsarist times to the USSR to the present. But I go further. Russia is in a state of precipitous civilisational decline as well as imperial collapse. But the challenge is that as this speeds up, Russia is more prone to project violence on its neighbours and the world, and more insistent on projecting its pale imitation of civilization onto others. And if somehow inflicting their political and social culture on others can bring it back from the brink of extinction, well, that is perhaps what they feel is happening, but of course it's not. As a result, everything the regime touches is either destroyed or turns into an inauthentic and inorganic zombie version of itself. Nowhere is this clearer than in the Forum of the Future conference that has just been held in Moscow. Economically, Russia is a weakling compared to its geographic and population size. With a combined GDP of approximately $17.18 trillion, the EU far outstrips Russia's 1.78 trillion per annum. The bloc also races ahead of Russia in the high-tech components of its economy. But where Russia makes up for this, for its weakness and disproportion in relation to its adversaries, is how loud it is prepared to shout, how aggressive it is prepared to be, and how brazenly it is prepared to lie. In that sense, the Russian Forum of the Future was the Olympic Games of vacuous self-promotion, lies and distortions, a world-class display of sycophancy, paid-for gobshites masquerading as intellectuals, and the inanity masquerading as profundity. The event is symbolic of Russia's civilisational decline, where people with genuine thoughts and original ideas are suppressed, imprisoned, tortured, and killed, whereas people without a useful thought in their heads, who have nothing to contribute to humanity, and distinguished only by the greed and alacrity with which they hoover up the largesse of dictators, are placed on a pedestal, given huge public platforms to expound their endless and inconsequential brain dribble. This is the future that awaits Russia, their national wealth burned up on aggression and showered on people who are prepared to spin lies and nonsense at the behest of dictators merely to signal conformity and alignment with the powerful. Intellectual heavyweights, strong irony implied here, such as Errol Musk, Alex Jones, and George Galloway, were in attendance at the Forum of the Future event in Moscow. It has been labelled as a far-right event, and indeed the sponsor and host of the event, Tsargrad chairman Konstantin Malafeev, can be characterised as an extreme nationalist, in fact a genocidal one in the context of the Ukraine war. But there are, from both far-right as well as far-left, contrarians on the speakers list as well. These self-professed personalities and luminaries descended on Moscow for the Forum of the Future, two-day event aimed at amplifying Russia's state ideology and an ultra-conservative, neo-imperialist vision of the future. Whereas the content was clearly intended for audiences abroad, the spectacle also serves an internal purpose, saying, look, all the important people are still coming to Moscow. All the powerful people are still coming to Moscow. And they are repeating our lies and our nonsense that is directly contrary to the interests of our enemies, the countries that they are from. It means that your dear leader is on the right course and that our enemies are decadent and in decline. We are strong and they are weak. This is the core signalling coming from such events to the domestic population. But do they really care? How is this any different from the ideological propaganda and conformity signalling of the communist era? Does it matter that decades of bogus writings and research from that communist era were rendered useless overnight when that regime collapsed? Well, perhaps this current Forum of the Future farce will be no different. But maybe the regime does not care. If all of this noise simply dissipates when the regime collapses, because all of this intellectual and political theatre is only staged to help perpetuate the regime in the present, give it a few more years or months of control. Anything that makes Russia's adversaries look weak is seen as strength by the regime. Never mind that what they are expounding and amplifying bears little relation to reality, truth, or evidence. So what and who are on the agenda? The titles and the sessions are very telling. We're going to do a slightly humorous deconstruction of them. Number one, fighting for souls and minds, ideology of sovereign Russia. This one is quite ironic, as Russia more closely resembles a dystopian sci-fi version of Gogol's Dead Souls combined with Tarkovsky's Stalker. Sovereign Russia is an interesting concept, a core concept in Dugin's utterances. And although his presence at the conference is not given top billing, be in no doubt that he was one of the key movers and shakers behind the event and its apparent strategic purpose. Number two, the new great powers concert, Russian foreign policy in the second quarter of the 21st century. Well, here comes the great power delusion, underlining the Russia approach that if we cannot be a great power in fact, we will project violence and toxicity at the level of a historic empire. We'll create the illusion of being a great power through our will to violence. Try and ignore us if you dare. Laugh at us if you dare. We will smash all of your lovely things if we can't have them. Number three, wars of the future, gamification of war. Again, this topic is rich in irony. Russia has perhaps done more than any other country to revive so much of the brutality and suffering of the past. It is unconstrained by the so-called rules of war developed in a supposedly more civilized age. Russia has lost up to 1 million soldiers to take a few hundred square kilometers of dirt and cities that have been reduced to rubble. This less resembles wars of the future, but wars of a deeply troubled past. But we must pay attention to the gamification of war. Europe especially must listen to this one, as Russia may here actually understand something of the future that we don't. Imagine when you have hundreds of thousands of brainwashed, militarized, brutalized, and immoral Russians piloting drones from their Moscow bedrooms. And they are causing carnage across European capitals, across European towns and cities. Well, we may wish we'd paid better attention to this one and prepared better to counter it. Number four, Russian space, race for Mars. Well, this, of course, is a nod to Musk here and the presence of Elon Musk's father, Errol Musk, at the event. But ultimately, what's the difference to conquering some black dirt in Donbass and some red dirt on Mars? They are both ultimately senseless goals. Number five, special operation demography, how to ensure an increase in birth rate. Well, this is simple. I can solve this one in a second. There's no need for all the drama and complexity. If Russia was less of a shithole, ruled by thieves and psychopaths, people may want to bring more babies into the world. If the primary focus of governments in Russia since 1917 had been to increase the welfare of the citizenry rather than reinforce their own power, control and privilege, then life would have been more comfortable. People would have had agency and control in their own lives, a prerequisite for tackling the collapsing birth rates and calamitous demographics in modern Russia. Number six, new migration policy strategy, organizational recruitment, Russian kafala, Russia as an ark of salvation. What do I need to even comment on this one? I think it is a self-satirizing concept. Do the people writing and discussing the topic of Russia as an ark of civilization believe this idea for 1 second? I think the first sign of a civilizational collapse is to utter such ludicrous concepts as these. The sign that the collapse may be irreversible is if they believe it too. By the end of the communist period, few believed that Russia had a solution to the world's problems and ills. The USSR collapsed with barely a fight because practically no one adhered to this delusion any longer. Russia's next collapse will likely be far more painful if a substantial minority are prepared to fight for the delusion that they have the key to the future or represent a unique and exceptional civilization. They will export their hollow nonsense to other countries like a malignant infection. Number seven, technological development, robotization instead of mass migration. Well, this is the racist undertones of the regime almost being paraded in plain sight. Russia is an ethnic empire. It does allow ethnicities to populate the power vertical if they agree to full Russification, including the internalization of prejudices that hold the imperial construct together and are prepared to signal conformity through political tropes and propagandistic conformity signaling. But what the Russian elite and many Russians themselves hate is that their industries and the functioning of their cities has come to depend on ethnicities that are not fully Russified. Automation and mass expulsion of minorities is probably the dream they harbour, sending Uzbeks, Tajiks, and Kazakhs back to their own countries. Number eight, spatial development from megacities to one-story Russia. Well, Russia only has one megacity. It's Moscow. Wealth, power, and control is concentrated there, as well as the consumption of luxury resources that are generated from all that wealth and power. You will find no one in Moscow who is minded to change any of this. What do they mean by one-story Russia? Well, who knows? But it seems divorced from the reality of power and geography that is modern and ancient Russia. Number nine, digital sovereignty, AI in the service of Russia. Digital sovereignty, the Russia firewall in service of the Tsar. This is perhaps the most terrifying topic of all, building the foundations of an Orwellian surveillance state, more intrusive and more powerful than the USSR ever was or ever could be. AI agents as the new KGB, allowing for infinite scope and depth of surveillance and the corresponding analysis of information on suspects, cradle to grave enforcement of conformity, the weeding out of all originality. And lastly, number 10, patriotic education, the image of the hero of our time. Well, not so much hero of our time, but rather a compliant army of militarized and brainwashed human meat bred for future wars. Patriotic education in Russia is already terrifying and based on the underlying concept that it's noble to die for the Tsar, no matter how pointless or immoral the cause. Well, this can only get worse. Other sessions focused on topics ranging from the multipolar world of the 21st century and broadcasting values to Generation Beta through content to Harmonious Balance 2050, a date with the future, a woman's view, Greater Russia 2050, and ideology and traditional values. This all sounds scintillating. The event speakers included Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, right-wing influencer Jackson Hinkle, or left-wing, depending on how you read his ludicrous posts on X. American economist Jeffrey Sachs, British politician, I use the word politician in a very loose sense here, George Galloway, and Elon Musk's father, Errol Musk. And it was hosted by the Tsarist Institute, founded by the magnate Konstantin Malafiev, and directed by fascistic ideologue Alexander Dugin. The Tsarist Institute built itself as a think tank for conservative policy, blending right-wing political and what passes for Russian Orthodox thought. The forum matches the Tsarist Institute's report on its vision for Russia in 2050. It lays out extreme conservative policy suggestions that align with Russia's revanchist, imperialistic worldview. Perversely, the report claims that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 marked a new era of regional world order. By launching the special military operation and openly challenging the hegemony of the West, Russia has entered the struggle not only for its sovereignty, but also for the right of every country to its own development, culture, and religion. That right, of course, unless you're Ukraine or Georgia or any other country that neighbours Russia. The event and report seek to position Russia as the global political and spiritual leader of autocracy and direct inheritor of the so-called achievements of Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Joseph Stalin. Note Lenin is rarely held up as a model of rulers that reshaped Russia, although it was perhaps he who did more than most to shape the modern character of the failing Russian state, the paranoia, the aggression, the violence, the envy. Tsarist states that Russia is a distinct civilization that's been entrusted by God with a spiritual and historical mission. This is not new, but it is a tired and cliched idea trotted out by generations of Russian fascistic thinkers. What that civilization is comprised of and what it's brought to the world is something they are a little less clear about. The idea of a nation is not what it thinks of itself in time, but what God thinks of it in eternity, the report says, invoking 19th century Russian philosopher Vladimir Solovyov. I dread to think what God will be thinking as he contemplates modern Russia. Again, unsurprisingly for those who have dipped into this distinctly Russian school of thought from the 19th, 20th and the last 21st centuries, it invokes the Tsarist era concept of Russia as a third Rome, a concept latterly used to justify Moscow's geopolitical aspirations to control the so-called Russian world, and the calls for a gathering of historically Russian lands, among which Ukraine is of course included, whether this makes any historical sense or not, and whether Ukraine wants to be part of that world or not. Of course, it doesn't. At its heart, the concept is genocidal, demanding the deconstruction of an artificially created Ukrainian nation. By extension, all the speakers who agreed to appear at the event are explicitly buying into and endorsing an openly genocidal concept, which is at complete variance with international law, natural justice, and indeed any sense of the rule of law. Remember, the invasion by Russia breaks numerous treaties and agreements which Moscow itself signed with Ukraine and with some former Western partners, as well as international bodies and various UN mandates. The report says Russia must deconstruct and restore the historical memory of Ukraine as an integral part of Russian civilization. Never mind that the history they refer to is fictional, mythologized, and flies in the face of compelling evidence to the contrary. Russia's version of history vis-à-vis Ukraine is pure bullshit, full of nasty fabrications and delusions. When your very foundation myths are built on lies and the appropriation of other nations' culture, then no good can come of any attempts to revive them or let these mythologies guide your actions and foreign policies in the present. Well, here are some other choice quotes from the event programme. Russian women should see the main purpose of their lives and the highest manifestation of their service in bearing and raising children, the report says on family policy. In Zagrad's ideal future, 85% of children will be born to mothers under the age of 23. The divorce rate is under 10%, and less than 3% of children are born outside of wedlock, and abortion has been virtually eliminated. In fact, this is so far from Russia's reality and historical reality as to be utterly, utterly ludicrous. The report cites the example of the Russian Empire, where, according to it, a woman's main occupation was marriage, motherhood, and housework. I'm hearing some historical echoes here from the 1930s. Errol Musk, who has previously voiced admiration for Putin, heaped praise on Moscow. Moscow is like Rome to me, the most beautiful city. I'm extremely surprised that Russia is portrayed as an enemy, even though it is trying to be part of the European community. In what way is it trying to be part of the European community? Bombing it into submission? Errol goes on, it is being denied this. Russia saved Europe twice, from Napoleon and from Hitler. How can you continue to paint Russia in a negative light? Well, he stopped short of filming a tour of a Moscow luxury supermarket, which seems to be de rigueur for propagandists in the Russian capital. But note the words that he used. Apart from their obvious idiocy, they bear uncanny resemblance to ideas uttered by Trump just a week later at the G7 and in some statements just before it. He claims, too, to be perplexed why no one likes Russia. Could it be that Russia is incessantly bombing Ukrainian civilians and committing genocide? Could it be, despite the claimed role that it played in liberating Europe from the Nazis, that actually ignores that the USSR initiated World War II with the Nazis and likely had a plan to try and overrun Europe through its classic technique of divide and conquer? It ignores the fact that Russia/USSR enslaved those countries that it cleared from the Nazis and claimed to liberate, often slaughtering the political, military, and intellectual elites of those liberated countries in the process. One of the main events on Monday was a panel discussion called The Multipolar World in the 21st Century. The panel included speakers like Lavrov, Galloway, Russian state TV presenter Dmitry Simes, former CIA and US State Department analyst Larry Johnson. Typical anti-Western talking points were on full show, including that the war in Ukraine would end with a new Yalta between Moscow and Washington, that the Russian and American peoples had a common future thanks to Donald Trump, and that only the corrupt US Democrat Party benefited from a confrontation between the two countries in the first place. Speaking to journalists at the event, Errol Musk again expressed support for Putin. He repeated several well-known Kremlin talking points, including false claims about biolaboratories in Ukraine and a supposed need to protect Russian-speaking populations. These themes, of course, are central to Russia's narrative justifying its aggression in Ukraine, and it almost goes without saying they are pure rubbish. Once seen as fringe figures, Malafiev and the ultra-nationalist Russian ideologue Alexander Dugin, who is co-organizing the conference, have gained increasing influence in Moscow since Russia's 2022 invasion of Ukraine and its subsequent aggressive nationalist turn. They have worked to cultivate ties with influencers abroad to shape opinion in Donald Trump's America. Well, let's conclude. The Future Forum in Moscow is emblematic of a failed state that enforces conformity over innovation and originality, prioritizes loyalty over talent, that actively persecutes dissent, dialogue, and contradictory voices, whose public forum is comprised of puppet voices and paid actors, mediocrities and entities, gobshites and extremists. The Future Forum is as absurd as it is sinister, a propagandistic facade masquerading as intellectual debate. Everything Russia touches turns to blood and shit. Every institution it seeks to participate in or inject its assets and agents into turns into a zombie institution with all the life and vitality sucked from it. The Future Forum in Moscow was a parade of mediocrity, a piece of hollow political theatre staged by an intellectually bankrupt elite that's ruling a failed state and clinging on to an imperial civilization that is in terminal decline.